It's really an honor and a pleasure for me to be here tonight. The Bay Area is my home. I grew up in Danville, California, east side of the Bay. So coming back here to Palo Alto, I still have a lot of family and friends out in the area, and it's just, you can't get over the weather and the electrifying environment here in Silicon Valley. Well, as you heard, my name's Leroy Chiao. I'm an astronaut, and it was something that I've always wanted to do since I was a kid, but I started life as a chemical engineer. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how I got into the business, but I was actually working up here in Dublin, California at a company called Hexcel Corporation after my schooling, and then went over to the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory out in Livermore and worked there for a while, and before I applied to NASA and became an astronaut. I went back to my passion because it was something that I'd always wanted to do. It was a dream of mine, dream that I had, like a lot of you here, you entrepreneurs. We've been talking about entrepreneurship and companies all day, and it's exciting. And it's the same kind of a thing. It's a different dream, but it's the same concept that you've had this dream for this company or this goal, and you do what you can to reach it. So, what I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about myself and how I got into the business, share some of my adventures with you, and then also, combine that with some different themes. Now, these are themes that you've all heard before, but hopefully this little bit of a different perspective will interest you. After I left NASA, I was at NASA for 15 years, and during that time, I had the good fortune to fly 4 times into space. My first 3 missions were aboard space shuttles, and on my 4th flight, I trained with the Russians, and I flew aboard as the board engineer aboard Soyuz TMA-5, flying to the International Space Station, where I served as the commander and NASA science officer during Expedition 10. After that very rich flying career, I got to go up and do experiments, got to do EVAs, which was what we call spacewalks, extravehicular activities, got to help build the station, and I even got to do a couple of Russian spacewalks. I decided it was time to go do something else, and I left NASA a few years back, and I dove right into a startup, very sexy startup, commercial space flight, human space flight. It was right up my alley, great stuff. The company had some funding, and a few years later, we fell flat on our faces. So, maybe that's something you've experienced here. I certainly learned a lot from that experience, and was really, don't regret a moment of it because of the valuable lessons that I learned, and it really got me interested in the business side of things, not so much, I'd already known the operational side, the technical side, and it really got me interested in entrepreneurship, startups, and the business side. So what am I doing now? Well, mostly I'm working with Mike Sandler, who's the founder and CEO of Epiphan Systems, one of the big sponsors here of SVOD. And we're, if you don't know about Epiphan, you can, of course, look us up on the internet. But we make solutions for capturing high-resolution video and then simultaneously streaming it, multiple images, streaming it as well as recording it. And so it has a lot of obvious applications, maybe applications you can use in your company. Now, being in Silicon Valley, you'll understand that I wouldn't be content doing just one thing. So I'm involved in a couple other things too. I'm the CEO of a little startup called Diomics. We make medical devices, medical materials, specialty materials and devices, and that's been an exciting ride, and also a big education. And most recently, Mike and I have been talking about a new idea. I've got an actual commercial spaceflight company, a lot different than you might think. We're actually going to be devoted to saving species of life here on the Earth and storing it in a repository on the moon. And if you'd like to talk about any or all of these, I'd be happy to discuss them with you later. But let's talk about space. Let's talk about space and business and entrepreneurship. And I'm certainly an amateur entrepreneur compared to all of you here in the room, but I've learned, like I said, I've learned a few lessons. This is the Ariane 5 rocket, a very successful launcher. It's a French rocket, made its maiden voyage a few years back. In fact, this was its maiden voyage. The idea here is that, space is a very unforgiving business. The consequences of even a small mistake can ripple through and cause the biggest problems. Now, so how do we control that? We control that by putting processes in place, and maybe there's some accountants here or CFOs, you know what I'm talking about, and following those processes and capturing all the things that go wrong, all the mistakes, and fixing them before they cause a problem. Now, the French were so confident in their process that they didn't do a flight test of this rocket. They launched with 2 paying passengers on board, paying passengers being satellites, communication satellites, each satellite being worth several $100 million. So payload on board this rocket when it launched was probably in excess of $500 million. Now, it's not the first time anyone's launched a rocket, the first time on an operational mission. Space Shuttle. The space shuttle, when the space shuttle flew in 1981, launched with John Young and Bob Crippen on board, first time anyone had ever flown a new spacecraft and a new rocket configuration together, manned on the first flight. And of course, fortunately, that all went very well. So the French weren't breaking any new ground in doing this, so they decided to give it a go. Now, the same can be said in business, right? Even a small risk, or I mean, a small, not risk, a small problem or a small error could propagate to turn into something big, something that is not good either for other people or for you or for your business, right? And in the case of the Ariane, this is what happened. Less than a minute into flight, the vehicle went off course and was destroyed. What it got traced to was one line of code. It was basically a cut and paste error. They had taken the Ariane 4 software, which was a totally different rocket, and adapted it to the Ariane 5. They missed one line of code where they had one gain value set incorrectly. One number set incorrectly, caused the vehicle to lose control and was destroyed. Fortunately, those satellites were insured, but I'm sure the insurance companies weren't too happy about that. Similarly, if something goes wrong with your business, hopefully you don't have any loss of life or any kind of injuries, but in the very best case, you're going to lose some money and time, and those can be deadly for a startup, as you're well aware. Well, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up during the Cold War, during the very beginning of the so-called space race. I followed those early missions very carefully. It was the early astronauts, guys like Alan Shepard, the very first American to fly into space. Those guys were my heroes. But, you know, I can't remember a time when I wasn't interested in technology, wasn't building model airplanes and model rockets. But it really was the moon landing, the moon program, the Apollo moon program that captured my imagination and started getting me thinking about flying into space and becoming an astronaut myself. And I can remember like it was yesterday here in Danville, California, as an 8-year-old kid, hot summer day in 1969, black and white TV set. Some of you here are old enough to know what a black and white TV set. Some of you are way too young. But, you know, the whole rabbit ears thing, watching those grainy images from the Mission Control Center as the Apollo 11 lunar module approached the surface of the moon and then actually landed. And I remember Walter Cronkite throwing his glasses on the table and he was speechless. He said, "Man on the moon." And at that moment, I knew the world had changed, and I knew that I wanted to be a part of it. Hours later, watching Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin take the very first steps of any human beings on another planetary body kind of sealed the deal for me, and I knew that I knew I was going to try to become an astronaut. So I worked very hard in school, and you know, my parents, coming from a Chinese American or Asian American family, not doing well in school was not an option. But this kind of made it personal, okay? And my parents were going to beat the hell out of me if I didn't do well. But this made it personal. It came from inside. I had a goal now. I knew I needed to do well in school so I could go to university, so I could qualify to apply to be an astronaut. It was natural that I study engineering, so I went to school up here at Berkeley on the other side of the bay, went and studied chemical engineering, got my bachelor's degree there, and then went down to Santa Barbara to do my master's and PhD also in chemical engineering before returning to the Bay Area and going to work up here. So I told you I was at Livermore when I put my application into NASA in February of 1989. 7 months later, out of the blue, I got a call inviting me to Houston to interview, and then 4 months after that, I got another call inviting me to join the next astronaut group. So as you can imagine, that was quite a thrilling time. Moving down to Houston, I put this up for a little bit for comic relief. This is literally about 20 years and 20 pounds ago. But it was an exciting time. I went and joined 22 new astronauts, 23 of us all together. We came from all different walks of life. There were research engineers like me, military pilots from the different services, the test pilots. We had engineers of different kinds. We had a couple medical doctors, even had a couple physicists so we could have someone in common to make fun of. I say that because Mike is a physicist. But we all came together and we had to learn how to work together. We were different backgrounds professionally. We had women, men, we had people of different ethnic heritages. And the point is, it's really, you guys know this, it's the people that make your company. That's why the company, the little space company that I started out with, that's why it failed. The people, they weren't the right people. Right? You know that. It's the people, it's the team, it's the way you interact. And whether it's in a mission control center, on a space crew, or in the boardroom, it's the people that are either going to make or break your company. And of course, you've got to be, you have to understand what you're doing. You know, I love the earlier speaker that said, you know, he didn't want to hire any a-holes. I like to do that too, but inevitably somebody's probably going to slip through. So you've got to be prepared. You've got to understand these people. You've got to know and understand cultural differences, Professional differences, I mean, it's amazing how you can look at the same thing and see two different things. And you've got to understand all that in order to form an effective team, which is going to give you the advantage and let you close your deals and be successful. Well, you know, I started out at NASA. Of course, we had an international partnership at that time with the Europeans and the Japanese, and I started training for my first mission with the Japanese astronauts and also with a French backup. So I got to know, started right off the bat traveling internationally and kind of getting to you know, starting to learn some of these things that I'm talking about. I finally got a chance to fly my first mission into space on STS-65 aboard Space Shuttle Columbia. This was in 1994, July of 94. And it was really a neat moment because this is something I'd been working for all those years, you know, the 20 some odd years, you know, preparing and studying and hoping to get a chance to go do this. And this was the realization of that dream of getting to go fly into space. What we were the second international microgravity lab, and what that means is that in the back of the payload bay of the shuttle, instead of having a satellite or a deployable, we actually had a little lab module that you can kind of think of as a precursor to a space station. Now, these are the days before International Space Station, so in the US at least, the way that we primarily did research and scientific investigations in space was through flying these little lab flights. The lab module, by the way, was built by the European Space Agency. We spent 2 weeks in space working in 2 shifts, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, and by the end of the 2 weeks, we'd conducted over 80 different scientific investigations before coming back to land. I pretty quickly got turned around onto my second flight, which was aboard Space Shuttle Endeavour. And the main purpose of this mission was to use the robotic arm of the shuttle to retrieve a Japanese satellite that had been launched 3 months prior, loaded with different material science samples to study the effects of the low Earth orbit environment on these different materials to allow us to hopefully build more robust spacecraft in the future. But the biggest deal for me personally, this is the first time I got to put on the big white suit and go outside and lead my first 2 spacewalks, my first 2 EVAs. Now, getting to go into space, of course, that's a biggie. You know, getting to go up there into orbit and look back at the Earth, and then getting to do a spacewalk. That was kind of, you know, the bonus. You know, the cream on top. Actually, getting to go out and get into a spacesuit, which you can think of as a personal spacecraft. A spacesuit, it's fully self-contained, it's pressurized, keep you alive. You know, it's got oxygen, breathing oxygen, carbon dioxide scrubbing system, thermal control system to regulate your temperature, and it's physically very demanding to work in, okay, because you're working inside a balloon. Every time you move your arms, your fingers, you're actually expending energy, and so you've got to kind of design your 6.5-hour spacewalk to kind of have little rest stops built in, places to kind of conserve your strength so you don't wear your muscles out. You also have to, of course, be in pretty good shape. You have to condition, you know, do physical conditioning before your missions to make sure that you can actually do everything and have the strength left at the end to get back inside and close the hatch and repressurize. What we were doing, we were actually testing tools and construction techniques that we were later used to build the International Space Station. So a few years later, I got to fly my 3rd mission aboard Space Shuttle Discovery. And on that mission, we were an ISS assembly flight, International Space Station, ISS. Back then, the station was very small. The 2 pieces we added to it, we brought up with us in the back of the shuttle. The Z1 truss on the right-hand side, and then the little black part on the left-hand side. That's the 3rd pressurized mating adapter. We used the robotic arm of the shuttle to position those pieces. And then over 4 spacewalks and 2 teams, we went outside and used tools to physically tighten the bolts and make the electrical connectors to bring those pieces to life. We also installed the main data link between the station and the ground, and that's that antenna dish there. It doesn't sound like a big number these days, but back in the year 2000, you know, which is, 13 years ago, we were told, okay, this dish is a one-of-a-kind. It's worth $100 million. Like I said, it doesn't sound like that much nowadays. But, and don't break it. So here's some photographic evidence that we did get it installed okay. After the landing of Space Shuttle Discovery, somehow 10 years had gone by. I'd gotten 3 Space Shuttle flights under my belt, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next when the chief called me into his office, and he invited me to join the Expedition Corps. So what's the Expedition Corps? This was going to be a change in direction. I had been flying and gearing my career, my entire career up until that point, had been geared towards figuring out how we were going to build the space station, you know, designing the missions and helping to design the missions and the procedures and the tools to go out and build the space station, flying shuttle missions, 2-week shuttle missions to go up and help do the construction. And now I was being asked to train to live and work aboard the station on what turned out to be a 6.5-month flight. So of course, the first thing I had to do was wrap my head around, did I want to go live in a series of tin cans for 6.5 months? That's a long time. And it was a bigger commitment than that. The training program was going to be at least 3.5 years. So it's almost like getting another degree, right? I was going to have to learn the Russian language pretty much to a fluent level because I was going to fly as a co-pilot, board engineer 1, aboard the Russian Soyuz. During the training, I was going to spend a month there in Star City outside of Moscow, a month in Houston, back and forth, training with Russian specialists, working with Russian mission controllers. Now, the cosmonauts, of course, they had to do the same thing. They had to learn English because they were going to spend half their time in Houston. And so, it was a big commitment. It's a big thing to think about. And of course, at the end, I already knew I was going to accept, but I took a day or two to think about it and decided to accept the challenge. So one of the neatest things about this experience that I hadn't anticipated, even though I traveled internationally quite a bit, this is the first time I actually kind of lived in another country for half the time, even though it was 1 month at a time. Where I got to the point where I could speak the language well enough and understood enough about the culture that I could understand the anecdotes and the jokes. And then once you understand that, you probably have a pretty good understanding of the language and the culture. But I started feeling like a Russian when I landed in Moscow. Back in the early 2000s, I would start saving the little bills because nobody could change the big, 1,000 ruble notes that you get out of the money changers. I started doing all these things, but I really, it was the cultural and language experience that was the biggest thing. Surprisingly, it may surprise you to hear me say this, that was the biggest thing I personally took away from this because I'd already flown 3 missions into space. If something had happened, if I had had a medical event that disqualified me from flying, I would have been very disappointed. But I think I have to say honestly, I think the biggest thing I took away was this very deep experience of living in the Russian culture and getting to make some very good lifelong friends over there. Some traditions were easier to learn than others, although maybe not to the degree that I experienced at times. And I'll tell you some stories about Baikonur later. But some of the things were more subtle. All you Russians in the room, you know what's wrong with this. You never shake hands over the threshold. But there are little things like that you need to learn about another culture to help you along. And I have to say, I was guilty at the time of not taking the time to learn little things like that and not to wish people good luck. That's about the worst thing you can do, of course. You don't want to jinx anyone. But nowadays, when I travel to a new place or I'm going to meet people from a different culture that I have no experience with, I take some time to do some homework because it makes a difference. They appreciate you when you take that effort to learn a little bit about their way that they do things, and that goes a long way. This is my home away from home during that time. This is Star City, of course, Gagarin Training Center, Yuri Gagarin Training Center. Looks a lot different than the Johnson Space Center down in Houston, I can tell you that. These are 2 of my favorites, or 3 of my favorites. This is Yuri Gagarin, of course. That was this huge statue. If you haven't been out to Zvyozny, you should go out there sometime. It's this really magnificent. This is the god, what I call the god and the goddess of spaceflight. I love the heroic statues and poses and things like that. Training with the Russian hardware was very interesting because something I hadn't thought about until then is that cultural differences is not just food, it's not just how you greet people, it's not how you interact. I mean, it's all of those things, but it also jumps into the technological boundaries. And Russian spacecraft and American spacecraft look and feel a lot differently. They satisfy the same high-level requirements, right? They get people to and from space safely, but if you can see that it's quite different, and so it makes sense, right? What's the difference between a Corvette, a Porsche, and a Ferrari? They're all high-performance sports cars, but they could not be more different than their engineering approach to solving the problems, the styling and the design and the look and feel, and the interfaces. Well, they don't have this anymore. I used to put this up just for fun because they were using some pretty old equipment that kind of belonged in the computer museum here. But they actually, not long after my flight, they replaced this whole panel here with basically a couple of desktops. Now, this is the Russian Mission Control Center. When I first went to Korolyov, where the control center is located, in 1996, they didn't have this big screen. They had a big screen, but it wasn't electronic. They actually had an XY mechanical plotter with a red light on it that would kind of go along and show where the spacecraft was. So they had updated it quite a bit once I went over and started to train a few years later. But this is one thing, I wanted you to notice one thing in this picture. This is one place the Russians are always going to be ahead of the Americans. Anyone see what it is? Advertising? Yeah, do you see the advertising? I guarantee you'll never see advertising at the Johnson Space Center. And if you'll notice, it's kind of funny, most of those companies are Western companies. Well, this was our mission, Expedition 10. You probably see me today with my shirt. We were the 10th expedition to the International Space Station, so we had a very talented graphic artist come up with the idea of taking the flags of the two major partners and forming a Roman numeral 10. Salzhan Sharipov was my crewmate. He was the brother that I never had. Salzhan was a colonel in the Russian Air Force. In fact, at the time, he was the youngest full colonel in the Russian Air Force. And just a little bit of trivia. Although he was a colonel in the Russian Air Force, ethnically he was an Uzbek who was born and raised in Kyrgyzia. And so he and I, of course that's Central Asia, so he and I comprised the first all-Asian crew in space. Well, the main purpose of Expedition 10 and our series of missions during that time was to keep the space station in a good state of repair until we could get the space shuttle flying again. We were flying about a year and a half after the Space Shuttle Columbia accident, so the space shuttle was still grounded, and we needed the shuttle to bring up the rest of the big modules, truss elements, solar arrays, and complete major assembly of the space station. But until then, our main purpose of our series of missions was to keep the space station maintained and repair anything that went wrong. The reason we were only flying two-person crews is because during that time, using Russian assets only, since we didn't have a space shuttle, we could only supply a crew of two with the necessary logistics, things like food, water, and of course, oxygen. But the main purpose of the station is scientific investigation, so we did perform as robust a science program as we possibly could. I mentioned before, it was really a treat to get to go do 2 Russian spacewalks. We train for spacewalks in Russia the same way we do in Houston, and that's in a big water tank. So we have a hydro lab. We have mock-ups or models of the space station modules down in the water. We get into the suit, get into the water. We have divers help us put different weights in different pockets until we're neutrally buoyant. And in that manner, we can go through and practice everything that we're going to do during our 6.5-hour spacewalks. Flying aboard the shuttle the Soyuz was also a treat. I'd flown 3 space shuttle missions, and getting into the Soyuz was a wonderful experience, both training on the systems and the simulators, and then actually getting to go fly. Quite a bit smaller, though, than Space Shuttle. Space Shuttle was positively luxurious. You could stretch your arms out, stretch your legs out. It was definitely business class, I have to say. This was definitely economy class, especially with the suits. You're really wedged in there, and you really got to want it. Very reliable spacecraft, though, has a special place in my heart. Well, this is the crew of Soyuz TMA-5, Salzhan and I on the left, Yuri Shargin on the right. Yuri was making his first flight as a rookie cosmonaut, and he flew up with us, but he didn't stay for the 6.5 months. He stayed during the 9-day handover with the Expedition 9 crew, then he came back down to Earth with them. Well, I talked about some of the neat cultural experiences. Oddly at NASA, we don't have that many superstitions or traditions. And that was one of the things I really loved so much about being over there, was just learning about all the traditions and all the superstitions. One of those traditions is 2 weeks before flight, we've finished our final exams, and so we go over to Red Square and we lay flowers at the graves of some of the greats of the Soviet space program, including Sergei Korolyov, the father of the program, and Yuri Gagarin, the first man ever to fly into space. We also went inside the Kremlin wall and we touched the Gagarin tree for good luck. This tree was planted in 1961 after Yuri Gagarin's flight, in honor of his flight. And since that time, every single crew that has launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome has come to touch the tree for good luck before their missions. Well, then it was time to get on this knockoff of a 727, go down to Kazakhstan. If you don't know, Baikonur is located east of the Aral Sea, and maybe fittingly, the airfield that we fly into there is called Krayny, which means last for you Americans, and it's about the last place on Earth. It kind of looks like Edwards Air Force Base after the apocalypse. But, Kazakhstan it looks a lot like West Texas, actually. It's a perfect place. It really does. Both on the ground, from the air, and from space, it looks like West Texas. Perfect place to launch and recover spacecraft, though, because it's so flat and there's absolutely nothing out there to hit. We checked everything out before flight, including our pressure suits. Here I am getting a pressure check. Each pressure suit is made for each individual. This is the position you're in the Soyuz while you're waiting to launch. You're in this position for about 6 hours. So that comment I made earlier about really wanting it, you gotta want it. This is not real comfortable. We're in there for 6 hours because you strap into the vehicle about 2.5 hours before launch. And then it only takes a little over 9 minutes to get from the launch pad up into low Earth orbit. But then using the communication assets, the ground sites only, it takes 2 orbits, each orbit being an hour and a half, to get enough telemetry down to the flight controllers where they can evaluate the data and then decide that the spacecraft is healthy, and then they give you the go to get out of your seats and get out of your suits and open up the hatch to the upper living space so that you can kind of have a little more volume. Well, we checked everything out, including our spacecraft, which you can't see because it's hidden behind the yellow scaffolding, but this is literally just a few days before launch, and they really do integrate the rocket that late. We put on our pressure suits, got inside, and made sure that everything was as we expected. This is what the rocket looked like on launch morning. You can see that it's been fueled, and liquid oxygen is venting off of the base. Here we are going up the ladder that takes us up to the elevator. There's the guy on the top in the coat. He was a KGB guy, or I guess it's FSB now. But he really was, and he never said a single word to us. We had never seen him before launch day, but he appeared. It was explained to us he was a security guy. And I don't know why we needed an FSB guy to take us to the elevator, but it's probably something they've always done since the days of Yuri Gagarin. Anyway, I never did learn his name. But anyway, we got up into the vehicle, got strapped in, and this was really interesting to me. Yeah. Now the launch bunker at Baikonur is dug into the ground only about 50 meters away from the launch pad. It's like from here to there. And I don't know if they had a shortage of copper wire when they built the Cosmodrome, but the most fascinating thing after that is that a launch officer actually puts a key in there and turns it to send us on our way. Now, all rockets up to that point that I knew of were launched by computer control. In fact, the space shuttle used to launch itself. At T-minus 31 seconds, control would change from the Launch Control Center computers to the space shuttle onboard computers. And at T-minus 6.5 seconds, the onboard computers would issue commands to light the 3 main engines of the shuttle. It would assess their performance, and if everything looked good, it would go ahead at T0 and send the commands to launch to light the 2 solid rocket boosters, and then we were going on our way. In this case, the launch officer, you hope he set his watch correctly that day so we could get into the right orbital plane, otherwise we weren't going to mate up with the International Space Station. Fortunately, he did. Like I said, it takes a little over 9 minutes to get up into space. Once we got up into space, we actually flew autonomously for 2 days, phasing our orbits to match that of the International Space Station. They've recently gone to a day 1 rendezvous, which is not a new thing. It's just something that hasn't been done in a while, because sometimes it'll take a little more fuel, and they wanted fuel margin. But actually, I would have rather gone on the first day. But it was okay. We got to the International Space Station. We spent about 9 days with the Expedition 9 crew doing a handover. And then we got them on their way home. We put our sticker up in line. We were the 10th flight to the station. We set up our work areas just like you would here on Earth, kind of set our computers up, set a few photographs, things like that. Saljan unpacked some of the friends he brought with him. It's going to be a long flight after all. Actually, they were toys from kids of his friends. And we began our 6.5 months in space together. Well, as I mentioned, the main thing we were doing was maintenance. But the main purpose of the station is scientific investigation, so we had as robust of a science program as we could. But really, most of our time was spent on maintenance and logistics. So we did repairs that were planned, changing filters, doing mundane things like that. Also repairing things that broke that we hadn't anticipated. Big job replacing a heat exchanger that was not designed to be replaced. The worst failure we ever had, my worst experience in space ever, I'll tell you very briefly. On a Friday night, we had a very smelly failure that kept us up all night. And I'll tell you about that later over a drink. Well, as you can see, the station is actually pretty big. Okay, this is the US lab. This gives you an idea of the interior volume. And so you're really not claustrophobic inside the station. We only had a crew of 2, and subjectively it felt like about the size of a good-sized 3-bedroom apartment. Well, maybe not so much here in Palo Alto. Maybe here it'd be a bigger house. But pretty roomy inside. And now there's a crew of 6 on board. We've been flying a crew of 6 for a while, but the interior volume of the station has more than doubled, so the ratio is about the same. Here we are just having some fun with microgravity, taking some pictures that would be otherwise difficult to take. Spacewalks, as I said, the EVAs were very exciting for us. The first spacewalk we did, we went out and we installed a remote robotics experiment. We also retrieved some experiment packages, sample packages that had been left outside to bring them back to the Earth for evaluation. On our second spacewalk, we went outside and we installed navigation antennas that were to be used by the European Automated Transfer Vehicle, which is a cargo ship. We also installed a GLONASS antenna, which of course is the Russian version of GPS to give us a more accurate picture of where the station is. Educational outreach is a big part of our mission. We had organized teleconferences with students from around the world, but that you have to share time with that antenna dish, and so everything has to be prioritized, so it's a little more difficult to do. What we found was actually using a commercial ham radio, we could reach a lot more students, and during the time of my mission, we actually set a record with 26 contacts, actually one a week during our mission with different schools from around the world, and for 10 minutes as we flew from horizon to horizon, we could talk to the kids and answer their questions about space. Well, the best part about being in low Earth orbit is looking back at the Earth and taking photographs. In fact, on this mission alone, I shot over 16,000 photographs of the Earth. I'd just like to share a few with you. This is looking over the Himalaya mountains into China, and from our perch of about 400 kilometers up, the Himalayas in the foreground here, they look pretty small, but remember, buried down in there somewhere is Mount Everest. Here's downtown Houston. This shows you what's possible on a clear day with a little bit of practice. Now in space, we're traveling at 17,500 miles an hour in orbit, and that works out to just under 5 miles every minute. So you can't just put the camera in the window and shoot because the image would smear and it would appear blurry. So you've got to practice and learn how to pan your target as you release the shutter. And by the way, you've got to focus, so you've got to keep focusing. And by the way, you're weightless, and so you've got to use your feet to hold on to something, otherwise you're going to float away from the window. But with a little bit of practice, you can get pretty good. Here's some different places from around the world. This is Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. Here's Mecca, Saudi Arabia. The little white dot in the middle, that's the Grand Mosque. Beijing, China, the rectangle in the middle, that's the Forbidden City where the old emperors used to live. This is Baghdad. This is Seoul, South Korea at night. You know, one of the cliches that you sometimes hear some of my colleagues say is that from space you can't see any boundaries, you can't see any borders. Well, that's not always true. Certainly no more stark difference than the difference between North and South Korea. When we flew over the peninsula at night, you could see the border very clearly because the entire south was brightly lit. There's a lot of activity going on. The north, totally dark, totally black. You'd never know there was any life there at all. Even Pyongyang, the capital, is just can't see a single light. Tripoli, Libya. This is New Orleans. This is taken in 2004, so this is before the hurricane. New York City. Manhattan Island, again, you can see clearly a lot of details. Central Park, of course, skyscrapers. You can see boat wakes in the Hudson and the East Rivers. Moscow? Yeah. Yay! You can see all the ring roads around Moscow. See the Moscow River snaking through the city. This is a large lake in central China, and I kind of want to direct your attention to the mountains to the left. Behind the mountains to the left is the Gobi Desert, and out there is a launch site from where China in 2003 became only the third world in the nation able to launch astronauts into space. It's Cape Cod. Finger Lakes area. This is the southern tip of Florida, very, very beautiful part of the world. The blues and greens are just spectacular. And by the way, none of these pictures have been artificially colorized or highlighted or anything. These are the raw data files I brought back from the station. Here are some glaciers in Patagonia, South America. This is the island of Sumatra, the west coast of Sumatra. You might remember at the end of 2004, there was a tsunami that really devastated the area. 2 weeks after the tsunami, the clouds parted enough for me to take some photographs, and you can see how big that wall of water must have been to go all the way up the mountainside, wash away all those trees. Just hard to imagine what that must have been like. Sometimes Mother Nature's just funny. I saw this out of the window in January. Grabbed a camera, had the perfect thing to send to my wife for Valentine's Day. Of course, it's been kind of hard to overdo, or outdo that in the years. Here's some kind of more artistic photos. This is an area in Egypt. This is an interesting desert scene with different textures. Let's see, there are a couple of guys from Ukraine here, right? Yeah, all right. Well, this is an area in the Ukraine. It's kind of not too far from Odessa. I'm not sure what was going on here. My chemical engineering background tells me this must be some kind of a evaporative recovery pond of some copper solution. No doubt an environmental nightmare, but made for a pretty picture. This is the Sahara Desert. This is an area in Algeria. This is Lake Nasser in Egypt, and I was able to capture this photograph at the exact moment, the right angle where the sunlight was reflecting off the surface of the water, totally reflecting off the surface, causing it to light up brilliantly like this just for a second. But finally, it was time to start thinking about coming home. The Mission Control Center asked us to put our suits on to make sure they still fit, because in space, you actually grow taller. In the absence of gravity, your spine relaxes and you stretch out. And so, they accommodate for that when they build your suit. But of course, we had a good laugh about that being operational, guys. What were they going to do if it didn't fit? We were still going to come home. Well, here I am on the right side, getting ready to come back down. By the way, before you get too excited about being taller in space, within an hour or so of coming down, you're pretty much back to your normal height. Well, this is what Reentry looks like. This is a photo I took from the station looking straight down at the Earth as the Expedition 9 crew streaked underneath. They're in that little tiny dot at the bottom. That's the crew cabin. It's using air friction to slow down from 17,500 miles an hour down to the point where they could deploy a parachute. It's got a heat shield on it, so the heat shield gets up to about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit as it comes through the atmosphere, but it protects the vehicle. The other two modules have separated, and they're burning up in the atmosphere like they're designed to do. And here's just a few seconds later. Well, we landed with a big thump on the steppes of Kazakhstan. Even under the canopy of the parachute, you're coming down at about 25 feet per second, which is pretty darn fast. 1 meter off the ground, soft landing rockets fired to help cushion the blow. Your seat has kind of cocked up, and it'll stroke on impact using a piston and as a shock absorber to take out some of the load. And each seat liner is molded to each individual to kind of spread the load out as much as possible along your backside. So when all those systems work, you hit pretty hard, but it doesn't hurt. Well, we were not too much worse for wear. The rescue forces were right on top of us. They got us out in about 15 minutes and got us into lawn chairs and gave us satellite phones to call our loved ones, tell them we were down and safe. After a quick ceremony out in Kazakhstan, they put us back on the airplane, flew us back to Star City. We were reunited with our families and our loved ones. And one of the takeaways that I want, you already know, like I said, you already know a lot of these themes, but one of the takeaways that hit home for me is that how much the Earth is really shrinking. And nobody knows that better than you folks here, because it's technology that's driving it, right? It's not just email anymore. It's not just mobile phones. It's everyone's got a smartphone. Who doesn't have a smartphone? And who isn't guilty of this, right? And with the advent of modern air travel, you can be from one major city to another major city, almost anywhere in the world, almost overnight. And so it's more and more important, as we talked about before, it's the people on your team. More likely than not, especially with you guys, your team's going to be international. They're not just going to be little valley guys here in the local area. You're going to have people in Russia, right? Epiphan has an office in Skolkovo outside of Moscow, and in addition to offices in other places. And so, it becomes even more important to make sure that you've got your team together, you understand the differences, and you make sure that everybody's working well together. A young man did this to me the other day. I showed the traditional handshake there in the slide before, and who knows, maybe in a few years, or maybe it already has become the standard here in business, but maybe this will be the standard way we greet each other in a few years. Finally, this is a picture I want to leave you with. This, of course, is a picture of the moon. This picture I shot from the space station using the long lens. And the moon, of course, inspired me to want to become an astronaut myself all those years ago. On the left side, Mother Earth, our home planet, the home planet to all of us. And that blue in the middle, that's kind of what I want to call your attention to. That's what surprised me the most the first time I flew into space, was looking back at the Earth and then just being surprised at how bright that blue is from the sunlight going through the atmosphere, causing it to fluoresce and glow all those different shades of beautiful blue. So this picture to me says dreams, and that's what it's really all about. That's what you're all here for. That's what SVOD's all about. That's what Silicon Valley's been all about, right? Dreams and striving and working hard to make those dreams come true. So that worked out for me to be an astronaut. I feel very fortunate, but it wasn't all luck. It was a lot of hard work, just like you were all working very hard. And I know Mike worked very hard to make Epiphan a success, and we continue to work hard to continue to make successes in all of our lives. So to everyone, I wish you all the very best of luck, and thank you for your attention. Thank you. Thanks. Well, I think we have a few. Do we have minutes for questions, or do you have time? Okay, I think we have a few minutes, and I'd be happy to answer a few questions for you before. Don't want to keep you from your dinner too long. Yes.
When will be, your opinion, space tourism? In your opinion, when will be space tourism?
Well, when will be space tourism? Well, as you know, there have already been a number of wealthy individuals who have paid to go fly. And in that way, I have to say, Russia has been much more entrepreneurial than the US. But when will it become more affordable? And that's going to take a big technological breakthrough. And I'll tell you why. The main cost of getting up into space is the cost of a rocket. Okay? And if you're a satellite manufacturer, it's going to cost you in the neighborhood of $100 million to launch a rocket. And so until we can get the price of launching something, imparting that much energy into an object to get it to the speeds necessary to fly into orbit, it's going to continue to be costly. And so until we find a revolutionary way to bring launch costs way down, I'm afraid it's still going to be limited to those who have the means.
Sergey, Ukraine. Thanks for such an inspiring story. We as humans always explored and ventured into the unknown, and you guys have done an amazing job doing this for the mankind. You mentioned all this technology that's around us, but there are so many unresolved issues around us. And don't you think that with the hunger and with the ecology and with the things that we can fight here on Earth, it's unwise to invest that much money into the Mars missions or into the space programs? Maybe,
well, you know,
maybe we're not doing too much back home.
No, your point is well taken, but it's a matter of balanced spending, right? So let's think about this. In the U.S. budget, for example, the amount of money that we spend on NASA and the space programs is typically around 1% of the budget. Now, if you combine the budget that we spend on defense, of course, that's a much bigger number. That's somewhere in the, I believe, about $400 billion range, maybe a little more. And if you combine all the social programs that we spend, it's even more than that. It's even more than defense programs. So if we take somewhat over $500–600 billion and we add the 15 to 18 billion from NASA into that, we destroy all the jobs that we are doing for NASA. We destroy the technology drivers for advancing the state of the art in electronics, computing, and materials, things like that. And most importantly, I think the most important things to come out of a spaceflight program is the intangible things, okay? I remember during the Apollo days and during the days when we launched the first space shuttle, even when we constructed the International Space Station, everybody was so proud, to be part of the effort to go do it. Not just Americans, but every member country, people in Russia, people in Europe and Japan, they were very proud to be a part of all these things, and it made everyone reach a little taller, stand a little taller, reach a little higher, try a little harder, and it served as an inspiration, certainly for my generation, to work hard. Not only for me to want to be an astronaut, but other people, friends of mine who were not interested in science, people who were artists, it inspired them, I think, to try a little harder, even though it had nothing to do with the technology that got us to the moon. And so I think it's important to recognize that what we're spending on space is really a very, very tiny amount, and we get so much out of it. In fact, I'm biased, but I think we ought to spend more on it. Yes, we do have to take care of people on the Earth. Yes, we do need to take care of the people who are having problems here in our communities, in our societies. But it's a matter of balance. And I think, where you strike that balance can be debated. But I think it's probably right around the right place. I think market forces will help determine that. Thanks.
Did you feel any gravity?
Did I feel any gravity? Well, certainly when we were launching, we felt a lot of gravity, and I certainly felt gravity after I came back. Well, I tell you what, especially my first mission, we were wheel stop on the runway, the space shuttle, and I unstrapped and I stood up, and I swear I felt about 5 times heavier than I really was. But even after a short flight of a couple of weeks, the impression of gravity was really strong.
It's hard to beat that question, actually. I'm here. Thank you for giving your talk. My name is Konstantin. I'm from Russia. So when do you think we'll land on Mars? And what is a really good reason for doing that?
When will we land on Mars? You know, that's really a difficult question to answer, because back in 1972, when the last mission left the moon, the last mission with people on board, who would have thought that here we are in 2013, not only have we not landed on Mars and colonized the moon, we haven't even been back to the moon. So unfortunately, well, fortunately, unfortunately, maybe I'm a little thick, but it took me a while. You know, I used to think that you did things were pure and all that, but the bottom line is, and this is not good or bad, it's just a fact. Everything is based on politics, right? And so until there's a political reason to go to Mars, and maybe that political reason is the international coalition working together on something even more visible than the International Space Station, in an international mission to Mars would be enough to justify doing it, because you get enough countries that are doing a big project together, something that visible, it can't help but spill over and help to improve relations between those countries who are doing it. Yeah.
Anna, one question I have quickly is, in this room we have a lot of entrepreneurs, and this morning we were talking that entrepreneurs are risk takers, but they're also very curious, and their curiosity is so strong that they'll take the risk to follow it.
Absolutely.
So as an astronaut, what are you curious about that drove you to take such big risks to go to space?
Well, first of all, I have to say that the risks I took were a lot lower than the risks of the first guys. The early guys like Yuri Gagarin, Al Shepard, John Glenn, all those guys, the guys that went to the moon, they were really hanging it out there. This was all new stuff. So by the time I came along, even though the shuttle turned out to be more dangerous than we thought, or carried more risk than we had thought, it was well more or less well understood how to get to low Earth orbit and back. Now, if we're going to go out and we're going to go explore Mars, I think we ought to go back to the original amount of risk, because that's a new program. That's something we haven't done. And I think that's one of the problems. And to kind of answer your question and then add to the answer to the last question, one of the big reasons we haven't gone to Mars is the cost. The cost is really prohibitive. I mean, even back in 1989, 1990, when President Bush 41 proposed a Mars mission in 2019, that sounded like such a long ways away. Now it's only 6 years. But the price tag at the time, back in 1989, 1990, was going to be over $400 billion. And so, people got turned off by that. But I think it's because we've kind of built into a risk-averse society, which is one reason why it's so energizing to come back to a place like this, to Silicon Valley, because there are risk takers here, and that's what we ought to be doing in space. And Sunbird Space Exploration Company, which I showed you a brief slide on, that's what that's going to be about. It's going to be about, okay, we need to put this repository of life on the moon, and so how are we going to do that? It needs to be a manned mission so that we can build up the infrastructure to send people there to take care of it. But we're going to have to accept more risk than we're willing to do right now. But your point is very well taken. It doesn't matter if it's in technology companies or in moon missions or Mars missions. It's a matter of scaling the risk and accepting that risk to do something that's worthwhile.
I'm sure a lot of us have questions, but also we're all hungry. So Leroy, there was a terrific presentation, and thank you so much for coming to California.
Thank you. Good luck, everyone.
To a SVOD conference.